Hey everybody, it's Pravus. As you know, it has been a month since Imperator Rome officially released, and we just completed a short campaign on this channel. Now that version 1.1 has been announced and we have a better idea of what changes are coming down the pipe, I wanted to take some time to discuss the current state of the game, where it's going, and, well, really, what went wrong with its reception. It's certainly no secret that this game is controversial at best in the Paradox community. Currently, Imperator has a mostly negative status on Steam with over 6,000 reviews. That's pretty dang awful for Paradox. But is it justified? Well, this video exists to express one man's opinion. Now, I'll say from the offset that this is not a review per se. I only offer my impression of the game as someone who's been playing Paradox games for years on YouTube. These are opinions. You are free to disagree with me at any point, but I will attempt to be as fair and constructive as I can. We'll be covering my personal likes and dislikes, some ideas I've had for improvements, the fan reaction on release, and finally, what changes we can look forward to in version 1.1, and whether they adequately address the community's concerns. Let's start by painting my background and expectations going into this game. When Imperator was first announced, I can't say that I was terribly interested. It was more of a, oh, that sounds kinda cool, reaction, and then it completely fell off my radar for months during its development. I only really started paying attention again when Paradox contacted me about the Dividing the Spoils multiplayer game that I played shortly before the release. After they contacted me, I spent a few hours reading through all of the dev diaries, watching a few streams, learning what I could. I was late to the hype train, and maybe that has colored my experience somewhat, I don't know. But I went into this knowing full well that Imperator was intended to be a sequel to EU Rome. Historically for Paradox, that usually means starting with the base code and mechanics of the prequel, reworking a few features, maybe adding in some new and exciting content. It certainly was marketed as a grand strategy game that would pull from the popular character features of CK2, the population mechanics from Vicky 2, and the empire building of EU4. But I knew it would be a standalone game and needed to be judged on its own merits and not strictly compared to other Paradox titles that have developed over the years. Familiar, but distinct. That was the hope. When Paradox gave me an early copy of the game to prepare for the multiplayer stream, I spent a few hours practicing with my starting nation. For the most part, it went pretty well, and I learned the ropes quickly. By the time I was ready for the stream, I told my wife that I was pleasantly surprised by the game. I found it more engaging than I had expected, a bit simpler, but lots of room for nuanced strategy and micromanagement. I was getting excited about the game. I fully expected that this would become a new staple title for my channel and I'd have lots of content for years to come. But then the game released, and the negative reviews started to pour in. It really surprised me. Here I thought I had found a game that my audience would really enjoy, that laid the groundwork for a lot of exciting content, and instead, I was getting Stellaris flashbacks. People called the game hollow and bare-boned. A sizable chunk of the community really hated the mana system in particular. Basically, everything was getting raked over the coals. It honestly made me think that something must be wrong with me for enjoying my time prepping for the stream, that I must have missed something. I have never felt more disconnected from the Paradox community than I did in the days following Imperator's release. That is not to say I didn't see room for legitimate criticism. I certainly do, and we'll cover the specifics in a moment, only that this was probably the greatest outrage I'd seen over a Paradox release in a good long while. Which actually, as I say that isn't entirely true. There has been a fair bit of outrage surrounding EU4's latest DLCs as well, and that actually might be playing a role in the community response, but we'll cover more of my thoughts on the general criticisms in a bit. Suffice it to say, I was forced to take a more critical eye of the game and make sure I wasn't just gobbling up whatever Paradox put in front of me, as some critics accused. So, what are my impressions of the game itself? I think that if this game had been released by almost any other studio, it would have been well received. No masterpiece, but a generally enjoyable game. But of course, the game was released by Paradox, and as such, there are certain expectations held by longtime fans of the developer, and ultimately the game may have shot itself in the foot by simultaneously trying to do too much and actually accomplishing too little. Think about the other popular Paradox grand strategy games that we all know and love. Think about the niche that they fill in the market. CK2 is known for its strong character focus. At times, it almost plays more like an RPG. EU4 is known as a large-scale empire builder, a proper map painter if ever there was one. Victoria 2 is more of a political and economic simulator. Each of these games distinguish themselves from the rest of the Paradox titles by appealing to a specific audience and doing it well. What role does Imperator play then? Currently, it's a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. There's plenty of Europa Universalis in it, which makes sense given that it is a sequel to a Europa Universalis game, but ultimately doesn't have nearly the depth of EU4. It has a population mechanic, where each pop has its own cultural, religious, and societal flavor, but not with the depth of Vicky 2. There are characters, and they do offer some level of intrigue and politics, but not with the depth of CK2. Everything that Imperator seems to be going for has already been done better, but by other Paradox titles. Now, remember, Paradox was specifically trying to create a compelling sequel to EU Rome. According to game director Johan in the Paradox forums, they started with the EU Rome code, added more depth and new mechanics, and I think they expected that the game would be judged on that basis. But EU Rome was released 11 years ago, and the Paradox lineup has set a new level of expectations, so instead of being compared with the prequel, Imperator has been compared with CK2 and EU4, which have both received years of development. So the expectations on both sides, from the developers and the consumers, were not, and still aren't, in sync. And I think that's a big factor in why the game has been so poorly received. At this point, I want to step back, though, and ask, was the audience justified in their expectations? And this is where I find myself in a minority, or at least it feels like a minority, when I say, no. At every step, Paradox has been very transparent with the gameplay and what features we could expect. I've reviewed the dev diaries several times in the last month. The game is exactly what was portrayed. Maybe that's one of the reasons I do not feel the same level of disappointment with this title, because I got exactly what I expected. Maybe the rest of the Paradox community was hoping for the dev diaries and early streams to be teasers, and secretly there was far greater depth to the game than there actually was. I really don't know. And it does worry me that I'm going to alienate myself from the community by seeming so out of the loop in this video. But let's talk a bit about why I like the game. What specific features interest me and keep me engaged where so many others accuse it of being shallow and boring? There are a few reasons. Firstly, I like map painters. I like playing aggressive and blobbing. I have a strong EU4 background, and even when I play games like Hearts of Iron 4 or CK2, I find myself playing as the Imperialist. It's even become a meme on this channel. So a game that allows me to blob and encourages constant aggression is already up my alley. But right off the bat, there are some key distinctions that excited me. There's unit variety in ways that EU4 never had. There are strategic resources that give key advantages over your opponents through cavalry, iron, and so on. The pops are more interesting to me than abstract development like you'd see in EU4. The map is gorgeous and runs smooth as silk. I've really enjoyed the trade system, which is apparently not a popular opinion, but I think that the flexibility to choose various bonuses and stack surpluses is intriguing. I'm also a huge fan of the invention system. There's a certain sense of urgency and dilemma when picking between several inventions before the next tech advancement buries them. Heck, even the changes to nation ranking changes the way that the game is played in a more interesting way, though I will admit that sometimes it frustrates me. Another major point in Imperator's favor, for me, is the modding capability. When Hearts of Iron 4 released, my primary criticism was that there would not be enough replayability in the base game. And yet, Hoi 4 is one of Paradox's most popular titles today, in no small part because of the really creative overhaul mods created by the community. Imperator, as far as I can tell as an observer, has gone out of its way to encourage modders to come up with their own content, and there are some pretty cool tools to change the map and the mechanics in significant ways. That may not help much with achievement runs, but if the community responds in the way that I hope it will, that alone could offer a tremendous amount of replayability. Paradox deserves some credit for helping to set that up. Now, these are just a few of the specific points that excited me as I play Imperator, that help it to be set apart from the other titles, but as I said earlier, there is plenty of room for criticism, and there are some significant drawbacks. One of the most common complaints I hear about is the mana system, and I'll admit to having some mixed feelings on this topic. As an EU4 player, Monarch points are not unusual to me. Frankly, it never really occurred to me to dislike the mana system in Imperator until people started complaining. It seemed like a pretty natural choice for an EU sequel, but at the same time, I definitely think that there are some imbalances in the system. Military and religious power, for instance, don't have a lot of usage. Sure, when they are used, it's impactful, but most of the game I'm just stockpiling those currencies. Compare that with civic or oratory power, where they're used all the freaking time, and you never have enough. But the balancing is off in other ways too. Mana is designed to be an abstraction of the nuance in the game. You, the player, don't have to script a rousing speech before the Senate. Your leader's skill is just represented by those points, and when you click the button, you can assume he gave a phenomenal address. The problem with this is twofold. First, it doesn't always make a lot of sense as a currency. What, your ruler is just stocking up on genius until you spend it? I mean, maybe. That's sort of how it works in EU4, but it contrasts with a currency like prestige, which you build up over time and try to maintain. Second, it gives a sense of instant gratification where perhaps it doesn't fit the theme of the game. In an instant, your council can come up with a convincing claim on another nation that provides a war justification. In a game like EU4, that took some time, and there were ways for things to go wrong. Basically what I'm saying is that over-reliance on mana seems like a substitute for gameplay mechanics, not a feature. And there are similar issues with instantly assimilating or converting newly conquered pops too. Though I will say, as a quick aside, I think that complaint about immediate assimilation may be partly, not completely, but partly, the player's own fault. Now that I have more time in the game, I can safely say that you really shouldn't be pressing that button unless you're on the verge of a civil war and need an emergency option. The instant gratification may be tempting, but you should be letting the population naturally drift toward hegemony under the leadership of your governors. I think that's what Paradox probably intended when they balanced the game. Now that I've learned from that mistake, this issue doesn't come up for me as often, but the developers may want to revisit this mechanic because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense on its own. There are other issues too. The game is a bit lacking in its economic development. Only 4 buildings doesn't offer much variety or flavor. Just stack buildings where they are the most effective for specialized cities and you'll do fine. The pops themselves are a bit simplistic in their impact, and they don't feel very dynamic. Roads are kind of a chore to build. The UI is sometimes intrusive and doesn't convey all the information I'd like. On another front, the military traditions just don't have as much variety and interest as the idea groups in EU4. There's also only one type of naval unit, and naval combat is boring, like many of the Paradox titles. Government types have very little variety, and there's not much difference between a settled tribe in Germany and Scotland, which leads to some of the criticism that all nations feel kind of samey and reduces the replayability. This is actually one of my biggest gripes. I said earlier that the modding community might fix this issue, but realistically, Paradox should not be relying on that. There needs to be a healthy amount of replayability in the base, vanilla game, no alterations necessary. Sure, I'm the type of player who will play for achievements, but that's not the majority of the player base. If I were a more casual player, I probably would only get 3 campaigns before I stopped entirely. One as a republic, one as a monarchy, and one as a form of tribe. At that point, I'd have experienced most of the government variety and distinctions between nations. That may amount to about 100 hours of gameplay, and is that worth it from a financial perspective and the $40 cost for the game? Sure, but I'd like to get a lot more. My last major complaint, though there are probably a lot more if I wrote them all out, is in the AI itself. And I know that Paradox spent a lot of time trying to create a more proactive AI, but I don't think it's quite worked as intended. The AI does seem very reactive, overly so. In my campaigns, I've observed that large nations have some sort of, resting cohort cap during peacetime, where they keep a standing military without funneling money into the war machine, and when war breaks out, they train like madmen. That could be fine, except when the war ends, the AI then disbands most of the new troops, losing the manpower forever. That is too precious of a resource to be wasting. They also don't focus enough on the naval game. So you can just block a far more powerful nation from reacting to your overseas claims just by blocking the naval access, as we saw in the end of my Epirus campaign, where I didn't have to fight Phrygia basically even once. And let's not even talk about the attrition that the AI seems to love so much, but at this point, I think you get the idea. I definitely see a lot of room for improvement and think that Paradox will benefit from the constructive criticism, so long as it is approached from a position of genuinely wanting the best possible gaming experience and not just venting anger at the developers. And on that note, I think it is worth bringing up the toll that this has to be taking on the developers. They've poured many months of their creative effort into making this game. We can all agree that some things could have been done differently, but I'd encourage the community to cool it with the personal attacks and vitriol. I've seen way too much of that on Reddit, in the forums, or in the YouTube comment sections. If we want Imperator to be a success, and I really, really do want that, then we'll all benefit more from constructive feedback than venting our frustrations. To that extent, I have had a few ideas as far as improvements to the game are concerned, which I'll list in no particular order. First, I'd love to see more provincial information in the national overview. Pie charts of cultures and religion, that sort of thing, so I know where to direct my attention. And then when I do select a province, more pie charts for the cities within that province. I'd also really like to see a ledger. I'm honestly not sure why that was cut before release. The macro builder is a cool tool that seems underutilized right now. I'd like to see potential benefits for buildings, similar to the macro builder in EU4, so I don't have to spend as much time hunting for the best cities. And speaking of buildings, I think that new buildings could be added, but tied to the civilization value. Aqueducts, libraries, and so on. Those wouldn't make much sense in a tribal village, but in a burgeoning center of civilization, absolutely. It helps set apart the civilized from the barbarians. More flavor. Pops could benefit from migration, so it feels like they're more dynamic and actually alive. The pop movement UI, especially for slaves, needs to be streamlined, so I don't need to spend 40 clicks moving 10 slaves. Game mode rules could be a fun addition, like in Stellaris or CK2, and allow us to turn off the Civil War losses for those who don't like that mechanic. And finally, different states, cultures, and religions really need more distinguishing flavors. The sameness of, say, Marian Buddhists to Gallic Druids is a downside to the game. Whether that be through events or actual culture-specific mechanics like in CK2, I'll leave that to the pros. Actually, more events in general would be nice. According to Johan, there are over 1,000 events in the game, but I swear I've only seen a couple dozen on repeat. Regardless of my personal suggestions, I fully expect this game will be fleshed out one way or another in upcoming DLCs. And if Paradox can pick a niche and really devote to it, the game has all the foundation blocks in place to support a truly excellent game, maybe one of their best. That is part of the problem, of course. Waiting for DLCs, spending more money. The player base has been expressing its discontent with this business model for a while now, as we've seen in some of the dev talks for EU4 since the rather horrendous reception to the last few immersion packs. I actually think that's a big part of why the players were already on a hair trigger to dislike Imperator. Just one more thing to spend money on when really all we wanted was a strong vanilla game at launch. On a personal note, the DLC policy doesn't necessarily bother me on face value, and it's worked pretty well for Paradox thus far. It's the price of asking a developer to continue supporting and expanding a game over the course of several years. They need funding and incentive to do so, but at the same time, the game needs to feel complete and polished well before those DLCs are released. Expansions should be just that, an expansion to an experience, not a mandatory fix. I'm not saying that's the direction that Paradox is going, but that business model comes with high standards that the player base has not felt is being met in other games. Now, speaking of fixes, let's wrap this video up by talking about the upcoming changes in the free 1.1 patch. From my perspective, this is one of Paradox's last chances to salvage the game. It's one of the reasons that I waited on creating this video, because I wanted to see their response to the criticism and what they would do to address it. For the most part, I think that this patch will be a step in the right direction. It addresses most of my complaints directly, at least. Whether it's sufficient will be another question entirely. The co-consuls of Rome and monarch consorts are going to be a huge change to mana generation, and each government type is going to have some special abilities, such as a war council for free claims. That will help make governments feel more unique. We're also going to be seeing heritages added, which look like national ideas from EU4. Religions are being tweaked with different omens, so now playing as a Buddhist in India will have different options than a Hellenist in Greece. I'm not sure yet how much that's going to change the gameplay. It really depends on what options exist. Maybe in a religion where you can get a research omen, you'll feel more incentivized to play tall, as opposed to a Germanic horde, which will play more aggressively. We're going to have to see, but the important thing is they're trying to add in some extra flavor. I just don't know if it's going to be enough yet. Technology is going to be rebalanced. That's ultimately a very good thing. Citizen spamming was a very strong and overly simple strategy. This is going to force players to take a more balanced approach and experience different aspects of the game, which will help to make the game feel more fleshed out. We're also going to see mercenaries nerfed, which I'm happy about. This is going to make multiplayer games more fun in particular, as the richest player often could just completely dominate by hiring a huge army. They'll still be good, but at least it's going to be a bit more situational. Stability is going to turn into a scale, which deviates from the EU4 model. No more stabbing a pig for an instant nationwide buff. You're going to have to work to maintain it over time, which is cool. Something similar is going to happen with war exhaustion, where you no longer can instantly reduce it by spending points. This seems like part of Paradox's effort to reduce the number of instant effects people have complained about. We're going to have to see if anything eventually changes with assimilation and conversions as well. We're also seeing some UI improvements, macro builder improvements, a basic ledger, and the ability to move your capital at a cost. All of this is good. I'm also excited to see that naval combat is going to be completely overhauled. There will actually be unit variety and tactics for your navy now. I'd actually say that this new system looks more interesting than anything EU4 or CK2 has put out to date, so that is exciting. Lastly, we're also going to see that our provinces are changing completely in how they develop. All the extra trade routes are going away, so no more commerce snowballing. Instead, you're going to have to choose between focusing on import or export incomes, and getting those extra trade routes is going to take a bit more effort. Pops are going to receive a cap, which makes sense, but with that change and the trade change, I'm a little bit wary. I did kind of like the existing systems, even if they were a no-brainer. We'll also see a new Monarch Point sync for the provinces, which provide permanent bonuses after a couple years of setting up. I'm not as big on these, especially since the civic and oratory bonuses seem the most powerful again. And then lastly, slaves are also going to be better distributed, which hopefully will save me a bit of the headache of moving them around. Ultimately, I'm very hopeful. A lot of these changes seem positive, but I'm hoping to see more flavor for the nations going forward and a lot more events to make peacetime more interesting, more political intrigue. Character interactions will be key as well. Those are being updated in 1.12, but I don't know how far-reaching that will be, so I didn't include it in my list. In closing, I think Imperator is a pretty good game that has the potential of being fantastic. The upcoming changes are a step in that direction, but after such a rocky start, Paradox really needs to knock it out of the park with these updates. The community, for its part, needs to start assessing Imperator as a standalone game and not be so quick to compare it to other fleshed-out titles. I think the devs are deliberately starting with a cleaner slate in this game, so it has the flexibility to go in a new direction. We need to look at that as an opportunity, not a fault. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you found my assessment interesting and reasonable. If you agree that I made good points, please let me know, and if you disagree, you're more than welcome to respectfully voice your own thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, I would ask that you hit that subscribe button, hit that notify bell, and I, as always, will see you guys next time.